Well, welcome back. It's Warwick Powell here with another episode of TIO Talks. Today we're joined by Ali Borhani, a great friend of mine and a great friend of the show's. Ali is the managing director of 360 Strategic Advisors, a boutique advisory firm specializing in growth and market entry strategies in emerging markets. But we're really here to pick Ali's brain as a geopolitical strategist and trusted advisor. He is known to be somewhat of a contrarian voice, but he speaks with a great deal of clarity and hopefully will help us cut through the noise and identify what some of the critical issues are. He is a prolific writer on Substack and is the lead author of Future Early, where he has a hand on the pulse of the trends. So we'll have a link to Ali's Substack in the video description below. He also curates a program, BRI Dialogues podcast series in collaboration with Durham University, which has brought many great minds to the world's attention. Welcome to the show, Ali.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you from a rainy day in London. And one of those very great minds, having been on BRI, has been yourself. So a privilege to be on this side of the table this time around.
Well, I'm hoping to learn a little bit about what's going on in West Asia at the moment. And I'm talking, of course, about the situation in Iran and Israel. Ali, of course, is from Iran originally, but I would say is a global citizen who is now in London via Canada. Ali, perhaps you could just give us a very, very big picture context about how it is that we are where we are at, and if we need to cast our minds back historically, let's do that, because I think without history, it's actually really hard to get a grip on what the issues are and what drives the decision-making processes that are at play today.
True. Thank you again for having me, Warwick. And I think for a lot of people, whomever tunes into the mainstream media, alternative media, or following the headlines these days, they all think that Israel and Iran have been, rivals and arch enemies forever. But if we go back to, the time of Shah and the creation of Israel, Iran was against the partition of Palestine, but yet was the first, but the second largest Muslim majority country to recognize the state of Israel. And the two nations went to develop, both covert and overt cooperations from fields of agriculture, to Iran being the largest supplier of oil to Israel, to even to the point that Mossad was the training, blueprint and teaching the Shah, Savak, and, the intelligence services of how to set up that infrastructure. So it was a very embedded, collaborative relationship. And funny enough, today the biggest issue between the two countries, one of the biggest issues and challenges, is not only the nuclear file, but also the missiles. Very few people know that at the time of Shah, Iran and Israel had a confidential, program for developing missiles, to the point that after the revolution, some historians claim, or there are talks, that Israel was just getting the funding from Iran, massive funding on this program, and took the blueprints and left with all that knowledge and data. On the energy front, it's even more interesting, because Iran and Israel had, with NIOC, the National Iranian Oil Company, a 50-50 joint venture, which was a pipeline from Iliad to Ashkelon pipeline. And this was pumping oil from Iran, as I said, as the largest supplier of oil to Israel. And energy security was at the heart of it. Now,
So
this pipeline...
This is pre-79, just for people
Yes.
with the chronology. Because
Absolutely.
the revolution was 78, 79. So we're talking about the period after the Second World War, leading through to the end of the 70s.
Yes, we're talking 1948 to 1979, exactly as you rightly said. And ironically, that's around 31 years or something like that. And that pipeline was joint ventured, funded by both countries, 50-50. And that pipeline is still to this day operating, but in a reverse mode, because Israel nationalized the share of Iran, They went to a Swiss court, an arbitration court in 2016, which in Switzerland, Iran was, claiming revenues and compensation. And ironically enough, the Swiss court rewarded Iran with 1.1 billion US dollars plus interest, which Iran never received. That pipeline today is working in reverse, pumping oil and pushing oil from Azerbaijan and Russia to Ashkelon and then to Eilat. So, so there's so much there, to be honest with you. And then if you even look at post-revolution, Iran and Israel had collaborations at times during the Iraq War. Israel, according to some historians and books, was a supplier of spare parts for Iran F-4 Tomcats. And they had a joint operation in taking Osirak nuclear plant. So we didn't arrive here, just out of vacuum. But then the relationship started souring, of course. More and more, both they started seeing each other, branding each other, and labeling each other. Iran was labeled as axis of evil, which was by, I think, if I'm not making a mistake, David Frum wrote that famous title just after Iran helped the United States, with Iraq and Afghanistan. Then, they created their own axis of resistance as a response to axis of, evil. But before that, and then Israel's, periphery doctrine and Iran's strategic depth. All of that has been in a perpetual, I would say, more of a whack-a-mole from both sides, but to a greater extent, obviously, in the past 46 years by Israel towards Iran. And the list obviously goes on longer than that, because this was, a combination of Operation Sphere, in which Israel, very proactively decided to undermine Iran's economy through sanctions and lobbying. I'll come to that in a minute. Then it was the Stuxnet, which was the virus to the heart of the nuclear program of Iran, and the Olympic Games that it's known in the media, to again take Iran's capacities and capabilities back. And then you had obviously taken out of General Soleimani, the highest ranking military officer or commander in that country, on his way to negotiations in Iraq, then taking out Iran's Syrian embassy in Damascus, then Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, then heads of all of the military and, the scientists on June 12th, and then the joint strikes with the United States. So that's a rather rapid assessment from 1948. There's a lot more to unpack, but I should stop there and perhaps listen to you and provide a bit more context as we move forward. In a nutshell, Israel's strategy has been sanctions, sabotage, subversion, a salvo, if need be, as they call it, targeted assassination or slaughter of, their nemesis, and the strikes of late. So we're in a very combustive stage of the two countries' relationships.
Obviously, the revolution was a pivotal moment, both for Iran itself, but also in terms of the configuration of the region and how Iran was viewed by Israel. Could you fill us in a little bit about what happened in the years after the revolution and what it was that ultimately caused, I guess, the souring of the relationships? Because clearly, for that 31 years before then, there was actually a lot going on that saw these two countries working quite closely together, economically, energy-wise, and as you mentioned, militarily and security. So for relations to literally do a 180-degree volte-face is quite a radical series of events, I guess. And it'd be helpful to unpack a little bit of that to understand what caused it.
Sure. I think the last few years of Shah as well were not all, void of controversy. Shah has an interview in 1976 with Mike Wallace, which I will share the link for you so that you can share with your audience, and in which he becomes very verbally and critically criticizing openly on air on an American channel of the relationship with Israel. So this was a relationship that was, of course, far more closer, far more embedded, but it wasn't empty of mutual concerns even at that time. I mean, this, claims or historians or comments that this is what happened with the pipeline or with, the joint military technologies and the rest of it. But post-revolution, Warwick, it turned into an ideological framework in and around the Palestinian cause. And that was obviously in direct collision with, the bigger picture and ambitions of Israel as a state and the peace process and the rest of it. And Iran wore that very much on its sleeve, on its, doctrine, if you would like. And then obviously the developments in Lebanon and in Levant and this proximity. And I was talking about the doctrine of periphery and, this strategic depth. So the two all of a sudden locked horns in an accelerated way. But I personally believe that a lot of thinking is given into the current status of the relationships. Whereas what I'd like to share with you is that in 2009, Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings Institution had published a paper, a policy paper, and you know who are the benefactors and supporters of Brookings, which says, which path to Persia? I want to quickly go through the table of contents because it's very telling. This is 2009. The trouble with Tehran, US policy options towards Iran. Dissuading Tehran, the diplomatic options. An offer that Tehran shouldn't refuse, persuasion. Tempting Tehran, the engagement option. Part 2, disarming Tehran, military options. Going all the way, invasion. This is 2009. The Osirak option, airstrikes. This next one is very interesting. Leave it to Bibi. Allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. Next chapter is toppling Tehran regime change, the Velvet Revolution supporting a popular uprising, inspiring an insurgency, supporting Iranian minority and opposition groups. And then the last one is the coup supporting the coup d'etat, supporting a military move. So this is 2009. We think that this relationship is, it's because of the nuclear file. It's not. In my opinion, it's more about the greater map of Middle East. This has been slow brewed, as if you like, at policy forums, think tanks in the United States. A great deal of it obviously goes to trade routes, Eurasia, the heartland theory, and Iran is prime real estate, if you think about it. If you count the water and land neighbors of Iran, you have 17 countries around Iran. It's not a joke, And then Iran to the west has Israel as a nuclear power, to the east has Pakistan as a nuclear power, and in a neighborhood that everybody thinks it's one of the most unsafe neighborhoods, if you will. So we have to take all of these things into consideration, but to assume that we are at this pressure cooker point of relationships because of nuclear file, I think it's a bit naive. This is far bigger than that. It's about geoeconomics, geopolitics, and the future of trade corridors. And I'm happy to go a little bit into, what happened during these 12 days and what may come next, if you like. But up to you.
We'll get there, but I think it's important to understand this sort of strategic context because, as you say, the issues go beyond the question of Iran's nuclear program and the extent to which it has or it hasn't breached the agreements reached 10 years ago. And but the issues come and go, so to speak, but the strategic fabric remains unchanged. And you mentioned the trade geography, and there are two things that seem interesting to me or important. One is, in recent times, there's been the North-South International Transit Corridor, which links the Indian Ocean, in effect, through Iran and then into Central Asia and Russia. The other one is, again, a recent corridor that had been part and parcel of an agreement reached, brokered by the United States, in effect, in Azerbaijan and Armenia. And of course, you touched on this issue of the heartland theory, the Greater Eurasia, and uh, and of course, right at the outset, we talked about oil pipelines
Mhm.
flowing through. Right, so we've got critical transport infrastructure, we've got energy flows, and we've got connectivity. It's at the crossroads of 17 jurisdictions. This makes it a focal point. Um, Perhaps you could just unpack all of that in a little bit more detail. Um,
Oh,
there's a bit there, there's a bit to unpack, so take your time.
no, well, I think before we go there, there is just another element to touch on the nuclear file. And I think the first guarantor that Iran would not become a nuclear power is Russia. A lot of people overlook that.
Yeah.
Russia wouldn't allow or sit there and watch another uh, country with the heft and size of Iran, with historically very good relations with the Western capitals, to become a nuclear power. One of the reasons that Russia embedded itself in Bushehr as well in the south was to make sure that everything is, you know, civilian oriented and preventing that. And they would definitely prevent that. The second thing on the nuclear file is that one has to ask, is Israel not a nuclear power? It is. I mean, it's not publicly said, but even, if you look at the interviews of Ronan Bergman, who is one of the best studies of what's happening in Israel, he, has alluded in a much more clear way to it in one of the interviews that I was very much more impressed with. But has that stopped Iran attacking Israel? Has the nuclear deterrence stopped these proxies of regional actors attacking Israel? So it's not about nuclear. It's that is just the facade. It's more about the trade, as you rightly said. It's more about the access routes of energy. And this north-south corridor that has been the dream from the Tsar times, and how Iran connects the Chabahar and Bushehr and the ports in the Sea of Oman and Persian Gulf and warm waters to Russia. And when you take into consideration the connectivity that this could bring with the melting ice in the Arctic and the role of India, so there is much of that. Also, if you remember, a year and a half ago, it was this India, Israel, United States, UAE, and the Europe India economic corridor that was an ambition to cut through and challenge the BRI and the Belt Road Initiative of China. Well, I'm afraid, if anybody has watched the past 2 weeks, the posturing in Shanghai and Modi's disappointment in the threats and saber rattling on tariffs, that as well is now taking a different shape. So the energy security is here to stay. All of those headlines and corporate social responsibility, the reality is coming to bite back, that we are dependent on natural gas for a very long time, at least as a fuel, a bridge fuel. And nobody can deny the role of the Middle East, or West Asia, as I call it, and as you refer to it rightly, in the future of prosperity. So the key question is, what happens if you want to undermine the Belt Road Initiative? I always say, despite the fact that it's Belt and Road Initiative and it's a sea belt, But Iran, in many ways, from a geographic point of view, is the buckle. If this buckle falls, the belt may not hang as strong as one wants it to. Now, the challenge here is that neither China nor Russia, beyond diplomatic gestures, have postured in for protecting or providing an atmosphere that, hey, don't mess around with this real estate. It's to our great strategic interest. And that is another element to remember, that Iran, during the 8 years of war with Iraq, was pretty much fighting, a standalone. Nobody was supporting Iran, hardly any country. And at the same time, Donald Rumsfeld was hugging and shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, and he was receiving. So for Iranians, they know they're alone in many ways. The realities have changed, obviously. The economics have changed. The sanctions have bitten very hard. But is this about nuclear program? No. This is about creating a semi-ruptured, balkanized geography out of that landmass, and promising each bits and pieces of it to the actors around, and then to divide and conquer. Because if that landmass is not in its entirety with, a homogeneous type of universal centralized governance, then you can manipulate it. Then you can disrupt the access of trade or these corridors much easier. The key question is what's going to come next? What is the next chapter, and where are we going with this?
Well, this draws, of course, back to the Brookings Institute paper, right? Because the game plans, the scenarios mapped out in that, of course, was geared ultimately towards either controlling it through proxy or causing perennial and perpetual disruption. And this approach, of course, is not unique to this part of the world, because it is a strategic frame that has been rolled out by the United States through various think tanks, whether it's Brookings, Rand, or others, to just about any other part of the world. So this now brings us, I guess, closer and closer to today. We're working our way from 70 years ago to 50 years ago to the last 15 to 20 years. And I guess we're now at a point where we have seen the outbreak of significant tensions manifest on TV screens and social media, which perhaps makes it more pronounced and recognised around the world for the first time, compared to a previous era when news didn't travel so quickly and easily. So can we now try and fill us in to today's moment as a launch pad then to look at the 12 days, look at the question of Russia and China, and there's a few things to unpack there as well, particularly after the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that was held in Tianjin in early September, and the prospects of a collapse of the temporary cessations of hostilities. So bring us up to date very quickly, and then explore where this is starting to unfold again.
Well, sadly, the two countries came to a direct confrontation, but it hasn't been that Israel hasn't been active in, undermining the defenses to arrive where it is. The last year's activities in Lebanon and in Syria were a prelude for these attacks. If those were still intact, and nobody can take away the speed, the agility, the ferocity, and the carte blanche that Israel had in conducting those operations. But had it not been because of those two out of the way, it wouldn't be as easy as it is in these 12 days. The 12 days obviously came on a Friday, 13th of June, and kicked off on 13th of June. While Iranians were going to negotiate with Steve Witkoff the Sunday after, So there is an element of trust as well beyond Iran and United States and Israel, which brings us to SCO in a minute. But obviously, Israel took the, what they call preemptive strike, what the global South calls an unprovoked attack. And then the rest is history. Obviously, the war went on for 12 days. Iranians were in a state of shock. They lost around 1,000 people in 12 days, if not more. Obviously, civilians were hit as the scientists in various programs, and the top brass of military. It's equal that Iran would have taken some of the best scientists in IT, or the head of Israeli military, and then America joined in, obviously. So Iran took some heavy punches in the first 48 hours, 72 hours. Like a right hook of a Mike Tyson, I would say. But then they gained their ground, and then they started punching back. The reality is that they launched around 900 or 950 ballistic missiles, around 1,000 unmanned aerial vehicles, and Israel had to obviously scramble a lot of its defenses, and it had the protection of United States, of course, and Jordanian Air Force. So a lot of people think that it was a ceasefire, but the experts are saying no, they ran short of interceptors very quickly, because Iranian barrage and salvo was much cheaper than their high cost and expense defenses. It reminded me that TAD, this terminal high altitude aerial defense, there was a song by Doobie Brothers, without love, where would you be now? I want to say, without TAD, where would you be now? But then that depleted, and obviously there was this rupture of President Trump, that he was boarding Air Force Marine One, and he dropped the F word and said they don't have a clue. It's not a ceasefire. This is a time for replenishment. This is a time for reassessment, particularly by Israel, because I don't think the issue, again, is nuclear file. The morning after, everybody said, where's the 440 kilos of enriched uranium? I promise you, if there's another round, they would say, where's the other 220 kilograms? So it's a perpetual thing. We're in September. I wouldn't be surprised if September 11th or October 7th, there would be another round of strikes symbolically from America and Israel on Iran. I hope I am wrong, for the benefit of peace and dialogue. But reality is that only people in Iran, Israel, and United States know what happened to Israel, and only Iranians know how hard it has been to take these blows again. But the whole world knows what happened in Iran, because it was broadcasted. So on one side, you have full picture of what happened. On the other side, there's very little insight. But Israel as well is not in a position to get into a war of attrition, neither from landmass nor from economic posturing. So the next question is, what's going to happen for a big blow, and what are the aftermaths of that? I personally believe that we have to look at, various elements. It's not just about Iran and Israel. Iran can, or some analysts say, may go and use, unmanned submerged vehicles and close the Strait of Hormuz, right? And you have to remember which geography we're in. 20 million barrels per day leave the Strait of Hormuz in oil, around 290 million BTUs of natural gas, LNG, all of the mega projects of the GCC, from NEOM and the rest of it. The GCC depends heavily on food security. The cargo and, the transshipments from Jebel Ali, to all of the other ports in and around north of Africa. And then if you have Bab el-Mandab closed as well, which is the gate of tears, then it's going to get very ugly very soon. Food security, 70 to 80% of the food for the entire GCC is imported. And then you have the possible contamination of Persian Gulf waters, where Qataris have openly talked about. Migration of Iran, okay, let's say Iran is turned into a Syria. 5 to 7% of that population is 4.5 to 6.3 million people in Europe at the time of Europe, with economic crisis and right-wing, parties rising and a militarization. So insurance, the charters for, large crude vessels, they moved from 20 grand to 80 grand during those 12 days. And then the bond markets and the boosting yields. And, the key question is who can afford this war? Iranians can't afford it from where they are after 47 years of sanctions. They know that, Israel cannot sustain it, economically or militarily. If this turns into a prolonged war, what are the ramifications for the global economic status? And as they say, qui bono, who's going to benefit? Why some people are pushing it, And in my opinion, it has to give in if there is a strike before midterm elections. That is why the window of September, October is very dangerous. And I think there will be some sentimentalization in the process of some of those dates, of tying it to the anniversaries and then going after Iran in a second blow. Russia is pulling some of its staff out of Israel, according to some analysts. United States is pulling some of its staff out of Iraq. German embassy has closed in Tehran, according to some, and many other European embassies have downsized. And Europe, in my opinion, is absolutely, not only discredited, but just a bystander in many ways. So we have to see, and pushing and piling up. And Rafael Garussi came out and gave a deadline for next week. Either you let us back in, or, it's going to get ugly. So I think the temperature is rising. The key question is who's benefiting from this, Warwick?
So who is benefiting from this?
I think this is a major game, particularly looking at SCO and the discussions and the victory parade and all of that. This is the grand chessboard of Zbigniew Brzezinski. But if you listen to Zbigniew Brzezinski's last interviews, he was much more different, a voice of reason and a much more of caution. Even Henry Kissinger, if you listen to some of the latest interviews before they both passed away, I think the younger generation are thinking that everything is about technology and superiority of technology, and you can, override your enemies, nemesis, or counterparty through tech. The reality is that geography doesn't lie. And no matter how big some of the sovereign wealth funds in the GCC are, they are tied there. You cannot uproot Saudi Arabia or, Qatar and put them next to Liechtenstein. If that region is messed up for, a decade, if it turns into another Iraq, even a decade, even a half a decade, obviously the catering companies, obviously the energy trading companies, obviously the military industrial complex, obviously the military tech industrial complex, the new ones, the data analysis and, the legacy ones. And of course, the trading companies in food and beverage, at the end, and the banking, because everybody's after a new collateral from Odessa to, Bandar Abbas and, but can United States be a power and a source of credibility in this case? Hardly, because if you look at U.S., you could look at their performance with Gaza aid peer that was 230 million and 28 million in repairs and only lasted 20 days and washed away the humanitarian foundation over there. So United States is as well very much gambling big time, in my opinion, from credibility on this adventure. They may win, they may push, but it erodes the trust and confidence. I mean, so for China and Russia, they're standing and looking. Obviously, Russia would have an upper hand in selling more energy, but for China, this is an interesting development. I would pause there and listen to you.
The United States has seen reportedly a quarter of its THAAD resources depleted in 12 days. That's
Correct.
somewhere between 6 and 8 years of replenishment.
Correct.
It has demands in other parts of the world on that productive capability. So it's got a resource shortage there. The failure of the US Navy in relation to the Red Sea issues and the Houthis is also indicative, I think, of an asymmetry
Mhm.
between the American military setup, and it is powerful in many regards, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's well set up for a particular situation. And it clearly has struggled in this particular combat environment to a point where, again, a ceasefire, shall we say, was negotiated, but which really enabled the United States Navy to quietly slip out of that region, in part with, in my view, the tail between its legs. So the United States is struggling from a resourcing point of view, as well as some of its soft credibility issues. The other issue, though, and we've touched on this, but I think it's time to unpack it a little bit more, is firstly the relationship between Iran and, as you
Iran
say, and Russia.
Mhm.
As you say, the relationship has many dimensions. The North-South corridor is an important part of it, but recently, in the last 6 months or so, the countries have ratified a strategic agreement that doesn't go as far as being a mutual defence pact, but nonetheless intertwines the national interests of Russia and Iran. So Russia has got a little bit more at stake now, and as I read, there is more discussion around Iran accessing Russian technologies, particularly air defense technologies, and perhaps even accessing Chinese military technologies as well, which up until now they've been quite reluctant to buy into. So, with those dynamics at play, perhaps we can just explore a little bit of where Russia now sits in its relationship with Iran and vice versa.
I think there are a couple of elements there. There is no question that there have been discussions of closer collaboration. As you know, these things takes time. It's not a plug and play. So all of those kits, all of those material, the trainings, the deployment, and all of that. So this is a decade-long collaboration for years to come. The first phase of that agreement, according to both parties, didn't have a military dimension in it. So it was more of a strategic partnership rather than military partnership. Russia as well is not interested in seeing Iran, fractured, because it will be another base for some sort of a, Caucasus playbook. So Russia inherently doesn't like to see Iran partition, but at the same time, it is very tempting economically as well, because if the region in Persian Gulf is closed even for a month, the boost to the Russian coffers and ruble and the sales of LNG and gas and oil is just going to be beyond beggars' belief. It doesn't mean that they want this, that is their intention, but that is the reality of it. But I think since those discussions and those 12 days as well, there have been this trip, Trump routes for international peace and prosperity, and the Zangezur, which is the Valley of the Bells. And I think the bells are ringing both in Moscow and in Tehran in many ways. You have to remember that 60% of the imports of Azerbaijan for its defense are from Israel, or close to that figure, and 40% of Israel's oil comes from Azerbaijan. So the key question is, if all chips are on the table, what's going to happen on the northern front? Because according to a lot of analysis and specialists, Azerbaijan was as well ground for access during these 12 days. And the Zangezur is going to really, change that dynamic. So I personally believe Iran is not in its current calculation counting on any of the major actors because of the delay that would be there in terms of, deployment, training, the rest of it. But I don't think that other actors as well this time around will be as apprehensive or as passive as they were in the first 12 days that they were completely caught off guard. And I think we may see a different posturing this time around from Beijing and Moscow. Does it mean by direct pumping of, infrastructure? Not necessarily, but I think it would be a subtle, but more visible and more tangible engagement one way or another. What that is, I cannot put my finger on a particular point, Warwick.
It seems that the groundwork is being laid by the collective West, both from the United States and its proxies in Europe, to prepare the population, if you will, and the rationalisation for another strike, particularly in the way that they're exploiting the JCPOA questions, which I guess leads me to be relatively pessimistic in the short term in terms of whether or not the combustion that is being built up in this part of the world is going to be released, or whether it's going to lead to another round of conflict. But if there is another round of conflict, um, it seems that all sides have expended quite a lot in those 12 days, which means that uh, that perhaps they don't quite have as much to give the second time round in a conventional sense. So where does this lead to, do you think, in terms of the risks to reputations as well as to treasure and equipment that the West is taking by not putting a lid on this, in terms of at least, well, but by literally creating and laying the groundwork for another strike?
I think there are different ways of looking at it. The Europeans are upset with Iran because of its posturing with Ukraine and Russia and drones. So that's why they're punishing Iran, according to many analysts. And in my view, Israel as well in the early days supported Ukraine in the war against Russia with, aerial drones, etc. So there are multifaceted there, but I think there will be a shift of assets from Ukraine to Israel through America, whatever is left. The key question is, will America's incompetence in really bringing people away from a confrontation, or its indifference to allow them to lock horns, and its intransigence in terms of being an impartial global actor, would serve America well or not? If this war goes to attrition, I think the costs are heavier for Israel than Iran. Iran rationed its salvo because it was thinking that it's going to go for another, 12 months maybe, or 12 weeks. So they were a bit surprised that it stopped after 12 days. It's not like, but they rationed their move. Israel obviously has the upper hand of intelligence and, looking at it from a data point of view and geolocations and strikes. That is something that Iran cannot match. I mean, Israel just lately launched its Horizon 19 satellite and claiming that they can see 50 centimeters accuracy. That is, the gap. But at the same time, I think if it goes to a full-blown war, the energy routes will be affected. Iranians will most likely not only affect Bab al-Mandab and the Persian Gulf, but it will affect the flow of those 40% of oil to Israel from Azerbaijan. Will Russia then slap Iranians? I doubt it. Then what would be the posturing of Turkey, which still imports 13% of its own gas from Iran? So the energy is at the heart of this. And energy not only in barrels and in metric cubic tons of LNG, but energy in terms of the societies. I think Israel population are fatigued, tired as well. Iranians as well, obviously, who wouldn't? I mean, apply the same conditions that have been applied to Iran for 47 years to any European country, and you will have different settings in terms of social cohesion and fabric. My view is that the global South optics are very important in what next as well. I think Europe and America are knee-deep involved in what's been happening in the past 2 years in Levant and in Mediterranean coast and Syria, Lebanon, and now Iran. So America and Europe cannot pull back at this stage. They have to go full force. They cannot all of a sudden, try to be, we would hope, but I don't think that is the direction of travel. And I think that has sent very unnerving messages to Brasilia, to Beijing, to Moscow, to New Delhi. And I think moving forward, we have to remember the very famous quote of Yigal Allon, who was the deputy prime minister in 1969 of Israel. And his quote is really amazing. It says, "A nation that doesn't know its past has a dull present and a future shredded in fog." The key question is, if Israel wants to drag United States, the rest of the world, to that fog with itself, and how long people will stay in that fog in, God forbid, another future forever war, but this time in Iran.
Well, Ali Borhani, on that note, I think we might draw today's discussion to an end. Obviously, we have to watch this part of the world closely. It has global ramifications, and I appreciate you coming on to share with us your background knowledge and your up-to-the-minute insights. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Warwick. I hope your audience will find it of some interest and insight for what's lying ahead.
Now, don't forget, everybody, Ali is a prolific writer, and his work can be found on Substack, and the link will be in the video description below. If you like that video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or, if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.